In today's lesson, we're going to look at Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, which is a poem from the AQA English Literature, Power and Conflict Anthology. You might find it useful to have a copy of the poem in front of you and some paper to make any notes. A pen and highlighter will also be useful. So in the lesson, we're going to have a look at some context to do with Percy Shelley himself. We're then going to look at some key vocab relevant to the poem. We're then going to have a recap of how we approach annotating poetry. We'll then go into the poem analysis itself underneath the visualizer, and then we'll look at some exam-style questions and any poems that this poem compares particularly well to. So for some context about Percy Shelley then. Percy Shelley was an English writer. He was born in 1792. He died quite young at age 29, where he drowned in Italy after his boat overturned. The life of Percy Shelley was certainly very interesting and it's worth looking into. But for this video lesson, we only need to look at a few contextual points to understand the poem itself. Shelley was a romantic poet, which put simply is a style of poetry from the late 18th and early 19th centuries that emphasises emotion, imagination, individualism, and a deep affinity with nature. So these are all themes that we can expect to see from Shelley's writing. The poem itself then was created as part of a competition between Shelley and a fellow poet, where the subject of the poem was going to be on the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II under the title of Ozymandias. Shelley's poem explores the damage of time and the inevitable decline of even the most powerful figures. Some context about Ozymandias himself, Ramesses II, as a ruler. He was certainly a very strong leader. He used lots of his power to command many battles that he was very successful with. He also was very good at propaganda. He often built statues to promote his self-image, which we'll see an example of in the poem as well. For our key vocabulary then, we're going to look at a certain form of poetry, which is a sonnet that you may have come across before. A sonnet then is a 14-line poem that follows a strict rhyme scheme, and usually the theme of a sonnet is about love. If we think about Shakespeare, lots of his sonnets have a theme of love. However, it was later accepted that sonnets could be about any theme, not specifically love. But we'll see in a second how Shelley uses this form a bit differently compared to its traditional uses. So next is a step-by-step guide or questions that I'd be asking myself as I'm annotating poetry. And these are similar across all of the cluster, and they'll also be very useful for unseen poetry as well. Just to recap then, I'd first look at what's suggested by the title. Lots of that we're going to need context to be able to make sense of. I then have a read through of the poem with a highlighter and a pen in hand and make notes about the meaning of any words and phrases that I already recognise, or can I link these back to anything that is relevant to the context. I then start to think about whether the poem has any recurring themes and why they might be significant. I then look at the perspective about who's talking to us. Is it the poet themselves, or is it somebody that they've voiced to tell the poem through? I then look at the structure and what impact that has on the overall meaning or what is perhaps implied by that. And then lastly, I'd then look at the analysis of language, looking at keywords or devices and what they mean. Let's have a look at annotating the poem then. So I'm going to refer back to our list of 6 questions from earlier about how to approach annotating poetry. Our first one then was what is suggested by the title. Now for lots of the anthology cluster poems, you rely on context here to work out what the poem might be about based on the title. As I spoke about earlier then, we know that Ozymandias, he was quite a strong, powerful leader. Who led many successful battles during his reign. However, we also know that he used lots of his power and influence to promote his own self-image. So there were lots of statues that were put up to make him as famous as he was. And we'll see as the poem progresses how Shelley structures his... Our second question then, we need to read through the poem and we're going to make any notes about the meanings of words and phrases that we already know of. So I'll read the poem to you. I met a traveller from an antique land, who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So, looking at some of the words and phrases that have been used then, we know that the speaker has been told a story about Ozymandias from a traveller. We might imply that because it's using I, that it's Shelley himself that has met the traveller, but we can't say for sure. I'd also look at the word antique land. Antique is a word that means something that's quite old, ancient or valuable in some way, which is a reference to Egypt, where Ozymandias was ruler of. This traveller then tells him that there are 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone that stand in the desert. And I pick up the word vast here, which means something that's quite big and perhaps unnecessarily so, which we could definitely link back to this earlier idea from context about Ozymandias promoting his self-image. The statue that the traveller has come across is big. We get the impression from the first couple of lines that Ozymandias was somebody who thought a lot of himself. However, the next couple of lines reveal to us that the legs, they stand in the desert, and near them, part of this statue, particularly the face of the statue, is starting to sink into the sand. So here I'd look at words like shattered, which tells us that the statue has been destroyed over time. Moving on to the next couple of key words then, the traveller had noticed that the impression that's on the statue is one of anger. It's described as having a wrinkled lip and a sneer of cold command. This might suggest something about Ozymandias' leadership. And maybe suggests that he was a bit of a tyrant as a leader. Our next couple of lines then tell us how lifelike the image is of Ozymandias on the statue. The sculptor that's mentioned here has really captured what he looked like and has captured this impression of anger on his face. The traveller then explains that he looks down and he sees writing on the pedestal where the statue is displayed, and it says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my work, ye mighty, in despair. So again, King of Kings is a phrase that would stand out to me. I'd link it back to this earlier idea about promoting self-image. We could link this back to ideas of the divine right of kings, the belief that the monarch is God's embodiment on earth and is appointed by God, and Ozymandias views himself as above that. He views himself as better than all those kings that have came before him. Again, in the next couple of lines, where it says despair, this again might link back to him being a tyrant or being cruel with his power. He expects people to be scared of him. Our last couple of lines then, we notice that there's nothing else around the statue, and it's now referred to as being in decay. And again we have a reference to the size of the statue that stands in the desert, but it is decayed over time and there is nothing that's left around it, which here might imply that over time Ozymandias' power has faded and it's almost been forgotten about, which would perhaps contradict how he viewed himself. He might have thought his power would have been everlasting. Looking back at our questions then, number 3 says, does the poem have any recurring themes? And as we've already noticed from picking out these key words, it definitely does. I'm going to make a note of them at the top here. So we definitely have a theme of power, and this is reinforced by the size of the statue and the wording that's placed on it at the bottom. We also have a theme of self-image or self-importance. We may even have a theme of the abuse of power as well, which again is reinforced by the description of the statue itself. And then finally, in the last couple of lines, we might have this theme of the power of nature or the power of time, that he's lost that power because he can't beat nature, he can't beat time. For question number 4 then, when we're looking at the perspective and who's actually talking to us in the poem, we potentially have 3 people talking here in a way. The I at the beginning implies that it could be Percy Shelley that's talking to us, or certainly a narrator of his creation. We then have the words that have been regurgitated from the traveller who told the story, and then we have the words of Ozymandias himself, the words that are placed on the statue. Number 5 then, if we look at how the poem is structured, as you mentioned earlier, this poem is a sonnet, or it certainly follows some of the rules that you would expect from a sonnet. It has 14 lines, but the rhyme scheme isn't quite accurate to a traditional sonnet. As we saw from the definition earlier, sonnets are usually about love. Not always, but usually. And this could be a deliberate, ironic use of the form from Shelley here, in which he tries to highlight perhaps Ozymandias' love for himself, his own self-importance. And lastly then, we're going to look at the use of language. Are there any devices that have been used and what they might suggest? If we go back to the description of the face of the statue, back to this quote here, we have cold command. I'm going to come down here to make this annotation. We can see that this is an example of alliteration. And this might give us an insight, as I mentioned earlier, into Ozymandias' leadership. Cold perhaps implies no emotion. It could be suggesting that he gave orders to soldiers, to his people, without any emotion behind them, or he perhaps didn't care about the consequences of them. And then the word command itself implies that there isn't a choice. He's not asking people to do things, he's telling them to do them. We could also look at King of Kings as another example of alliteration, which could be referencing or referring to the divine right of kings. And him saying King of Kings again reinforces his sense of self-importance. He thinks he's above others, he thinks he's better than other rulers. And last thing then for our language analysis, we could look at the use of sibilants in the line. The lone and level sands stretch far away. These sibilant sounds perhaps could reflect the sound of the sand as it moves across the desert. And again, Shelley leaves us with this line that reinforces that Ozymandias' power has disappeared. There's nothing else around it. So some example questions then that you could use to practice responding to questions about Ozymandias. The two I've got on screen, they both link back to power. So the first one is, how does Shelley present ideas about the power of time in Ozymandias? And how does Shelley present ideas about the power of nature? Looking at those two themes, If you wanted to have a go at comparing those, then this would compare quite nicely with London and with My Last Duchess as well. And lastly, well done for completing this video lesson. Just a reminder that every bit of revision you do from now up until your exams will be extremely useful. I've been Tom, thank you for watching.